The order was given at 11 minutes past 10 in the morning, and I wrote it down, because writing things down is what I am for. Stand up. Mr. Justice Devereux did not look up when he said it. That is the part I have never been able to explain away, not in the years since, not to the men who asked me afterward how it could have happened in a court like ours. He did not look up. He said the two words to his own notes, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who has said them 9,000 times and has never once had to say them twice, and he reached for his pen, and he waited for the sound of a body coming to its feet. The sound did not come. I am Elias Fenn. I have been clerk of court number 1 at the Assize of Harrogate for 31 years, which means I have sat below the bench, with my back to the judge and my face to the room, for longer than most of the men in that room have been alive. I know the acoustics of that court the way a bargeman knows a river, the creak the front bench makes when a barrister leans forward, the settling of the public gallery, and the exact quality of the hush that arrives when somebody has just done something that cannot be undone. That was the hush I heard at 11 minutes past 10. I turned my head. I should not have. The clerk faces front. The clerk does not gawk, but I turned my head and looked down the length of the front bench, past the wigs and the black gowns and the stacked case bundles, to the end of the row where the floor had been cleared of a chair to make a space. In the space was a man in a red tunic. He was in full dress. That is the first thing anyone noticed, and the first thing anyone still says when they tell this story badly. Scarlet wool, brass buttons polished to a hard little sun apiece, white gloves, a row of ribbons over the heart, the collar high and immaculate. His bearskin was in his lap, cradled the way you would hold something you had been trusted with. His shoulders were square. His back was straight, straighter than mine, straighter than any man's in that room, and I include the judge. And he was sitting in a wheelchair, and he did not get up. Stand up, said Mr. Justice Devereux again, and this time he did look up, and I watched him find the man he was speaking to, and I watched the small, cold correction go through his face. The flicker of a man who has discovered an irregularity in his own courtroom and has decided in the space of half a breath whose fault it is. I am unable, my lord, the man said. 2 words could not have been more evenly spoken. There was no apology in them and no complaint in them. He might have been reporting the weather to an officer. I want to be fair to Corin Devereux, even now. If I make him a monster, then the whole thing becomes a story about a monster, and it was never that. It was a story about the rest of us. He was 61, 26 years on that bench, and the son of a court usher, a man who had spent 40 years opening doors for barristers who never learned his name. He believed in the court, not in himself, in the court. The forms of it, the rising, the bowing, the fixed and ancient courtesies, were not decoration but structure. He used to tell the juniors, the way the ribs of a ship are not decoration. But a man who spends his life defending the forms will, in the end, mistake the form for the thing. And a man who has clawed his way up from a doorway will hear insolence where there is none, because he has been listening for it since he was 17. Unable, Mr. Justice Devereux repeated, and let the word sit there in the air where everyone could look at it. Or unwilling. Unable, my lord. Then you will explain to this court the nature of your inability. The man in the red tunic looked back at him. He had a face that had been out in weather, that flat, planed, unhurried look you see on men who have stood a great many hours in the cold and stopped resenting it a long time ago. Perhaps 39. Gray coming in at the temples, cropped so short it was more a suggestion than a color. His hands rested on the crown of the bearskin, gloved still. No, my lord, he said. And that, if you want the exact hinge of the thing, was where the morning came off its rails. I should tell you why the court was sitting, because everything that followed was hung on it, and because the case itself is the reason I still cannot think of that day without a taste in my mouth. The defendant was a man named Kester Mayle, 26 years old, well-dressed, well-connected in the loose way that people are when they have money that came from somewhere else. He had pleaded guilty at the last possible moment, which is what men do when their counsel finally shows them the evidence, and they understand that the room is not going to be charmed. 9 weeks earlier, at the north gate of the palace, on a bright cold afternoon with 200 people watching and 40 of them filming, Kester Mayle had walked up to a sentry of the king's guard and knocked his bearskin off his head with the flat of his hand. The sentry was 19, Private Ivo Wren, 11 weeks out of the depot on his 4th week of public duties, standing his post the way he had been drilled to stand it, eyes front, weapon at his side, feet planted, no reaction, no expression, no engagement. That is the whole of the discipline. It is not passivity. It is a decision, renewed every 4 seconds for 2 hours, that you will not be the man who breaks. Mayle knocked the bearskin off, and Private Wren did not move. So Mayle picked the bearskin up, put it on his own head, and posed. And Private Wren did not move. So Mayle, who by then had an audience and had gone past the point where an audience can be safely left unsatisfied, leaned in close and said something to him, and then he hit him. He hit him twice. The second time was worse than the first. Private Wren's jaw was broken in 2 places, and he stood for 11 more seconds. I have watched the footage more times than is good for me, and it is 11 seconds before the corporal of the guard reached him and took him off his feet and out of the line. The whole of it was on a dozen phones. Mayle had filmed it himself from his own hand and put it out into the world with a caption I will not repeat, and the world had done what the world does. By the time he was arrested, he had a great many new admirers and one very expensive silk. The silk was Mr. Havern Seath, and Mr. Seath had a strategy, and the strategy was this: that a king's guardsman is trained to be struck, that he stands there in a red coat as a monument, an ornament, a thing to be photographed, that he is paid, the word Seath used in the plea in mitigation was *paid, to absorb the foolishness of the public, that no true indignity is possible to a man who has volunteered for a life of being looked at. And that Private Ivo Wren, who had not flinched, had by his very stillness demonstrated that he had not been harmed in any way the law should trouble itself with. I had read the mitigation the night before. I had read the phrase *, he did not even react 3 times, in 3 different sentences, and I had gone to bed angry in a way that a clerk of 31 years is not supposed to permit himself. That was the case. That was the room. And into that room that morning had come the man in the wheelchair, in full dress, carrying a paper to speak for the boy. Because Private Wren could not speak for himself. His jaw was wired. He was sitting in the 2nd row of the public gallery with his hands folded and a small pad of paper on his knee, 19 years old, in a plain suit that did not fit him, and he could make a sound but he could not make a word. So the regiment had sent someone to read the statement in his place. And the someone was a color sergeant, and his name was Corin Ashgrove, and he was the master of the colors of the King's Guard, and he had been told by the court office in writing that he might attend and speak, and he had come. "Color Sergeant," said Mr. Justice Devereux. He had found the name on his list now. He held it up like something he had caught. "You are here in what capacity?" "To read a statement to the court, my lord, on behalf of Private Wren, who cannot read it himself, and on behalf of my regiment." "On behalf of your regiment." Devereux set the paper down. "I observe that the seat reserved on the front bench for the representative of the colonel-in-chief is empty." "Yes, my lord." "Has your regiment sent anyone else?" "Not as yet, my lord." I remember watching the judge's mouth. There is a thing that happens to a proud man when he suspects he is being slighted by people who have never had to be proud, and it happened then. He had seen an empty chair with a reserved card on it, and he had drawn the conclusion he had been drawing since he was 17, which was that the Grand had not thought his court worth their time. And now here was a man in a scarlet coat, in the front of his court, refusing to rise. "Color Sergeant Ashgrove," he said, "when I address a person in this court, that person stands. That is not a whim of mine. It is not a courtesy to me. I am a man of no importance whatsoever, and I will be forgotten in 10 years as I should be. It is a courtesy to the law which is not going to be forgotten, and which is the only thing standing between a boy with a broken jaw and a world in which nobody comes when he is struck. When you refuse to rise, you are not insulting me. You are telling this room that the law is beneath your notice. Now stand up. And I will tell you plainly, it was a good speech. Half of it was true. If he had said it to almost any other man in the realm, he would have been right, and the man would have stood, and the day would have gone on, and no one would ever have written a word about Court Number 1. Color Sergeant Ashgrove listened to all of it without moving so much as a finger. When it was over, he said, "My lord, I have been in the king's service for 21 years. There is nothing in this room that I hold beneath my notice." "Then stand." "I cannot, my lord." "Why?" And there it was, and the whole room leaned in for it, and I leaned in for it too, God forgive me. And Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove looked up at the bench and said, "I did not bring my injuries to court, my lord. I brought the boys." I have gone over the next 90 seconds more times than any other 90 seconds of my working life. I could have stopped it. That is the plain fact, and I have made my peace with it in the only way a man can, which is badly and slowly. I was the clerk. It was my file. And in my file, 3 weeks old, initialed in the corner in my own hand, was a piece of paper that would have ended the whole thing before it began. But I did not know that yet, and so I sat there with my pen in my hand, and I let it happen. "Color Sergeant," said Mr. Justice Devereux, and his voice had changed. It had gone quiet, which was much worse. "I will give you one further opportunity, and I will be exact, so there can be no misunderstanding afterward, and none in the newspapers, which I imagine is where you would prefer this to go. If you have a reason, give it to me now on the record, and I will hear it with respect. If you have no reason, you will stand. And if you will do neither, then I am obliged. I am obliged * Color Sergeant. I take no satisfaction in it. To treat what you are doing as a contempt of this court, in front of these people, and in front of the young man in the gallery whose statement you have come here to read." That last was cruel. He knew it was cruel. He had reached for the thing that would work. Ashgrove's gloved hands did not move on the bearskin. He said, "My lord, the statement is 4 pages. It took the private 9 days to write with a pencil because he cannot speak. I would ask the court to hear it." "Stand up." "No, my lord." The pen came down on the bench. "Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove," said Mr. Justice Devereux, "I find you in contempt of this court. You are fined the sum of 200 crowns, and you will be detained in the cells of this building until the court rises this evening, at which time you will be brought before me again. And if you are then prepared to purge your contempt by an apology, you will be released, and if you are not, you will spend the night." He looked down at the man in the red tunic, and I watched him wait for something. Some crack, some shift. He had been breaking men across that bench for 26 years, and he had never in his life met one who simply took it. "Very good, my lord," said Color Sergeant Ashgrove. He handed the 4 pages to the usher, carefully, squaring them first, as though they were something being passed from one sentry to another at a change of post. And then he put his bearskin on his lap and turned the wheels of his chair with his own hands, and beat on Giles, who has been an usher in this building for 40 years, and whose father was an usher before him, opened the door for him, and Color Sergeant Ashgrove went out of Court Number 1 and down to the cells without a word, and did not look back and did not hurry. The door closed, and in the second row of the gallery, a 19-year-old boy with a wired jaw put both hands over his face. The court rose for the short adjournment at 25 minutes to 11, and I went to the file. I want to be precise about why I went. It was not conscience. It was procedure, which in a man like me is the same organ and does the same work. There is a rule, Rule 11 of the practice rules of the assize, and I could have recited it in my sleep at 19, and could recite it now on my deathbed. which provides that where a person required to attend upon the court is unable by reason of physical infirmity to comply with the customary observances of the court, that person may lodge with the court office a certificate to that effect, and upon lodging it shall be excused, and no inference shall be drawn. Rule 11. Every clerk knows Rule 11. It exists because the law is old and has, over the centuries, occasionally been embarrassed by its own furniture. I went to the file because I wanted to be able to say, when the appeal came, and I already knew there would be an appeal, and I already knew what the newspapers would make of it, that the certificate had never been lodged, that we had done everything correctly, that the fault was his. I opened the bundle for mail, Kester, sentencing court number 1, and it was not there. So I opened the correspondence bundle, and it was not there. And then I opened the general office file for the term, which is a fat dead thing that nobody reads, where we put the things that do not have a home, and it was there. Third from the top. A certificate under Rule 11, on the letterhead of the King's Guard, in respect of Color Sergeant C. Ashgrove, stating that by reason of injuries sustained in the King's service, he was permanently unable to stand or to rise, and requesting that the court be so informed. Dated 3 weeks earlier, signed by a regimental surgeon. And in the top right corner, in blue ink, in a small tidy hand I have used every working day since I was 24. E.F. I had initialed it. I had had it in my hands. I had not read it. I had been holding 4 other things and a cup of tea, and a junior clerk had put it in front of me and said Sir Asterisk, and I had put my initials on the corner and gone on with my day, and I had filed it, or someone had filed it on my say-so, in the fat dead file that nobody reads. I stood in the records room of the Assize of Harrogate with that paper in my hand for a length of time I could not afterward account for. My legs were perfectly sound. I could stand as long as I liked. I remember thinking, with a clarity that has never entirely left me, he did not refuse to tell you. He told you 3 weeks ago, in writing, and you did not look. I went to the judge's chambers with the certificate in my hand, and I put it on his desk. Mr. Justice Deverell was standing at his window with his wig off and his hands behind his back. Without the wig he looked like exactly what he was, which was a tired man of 61, with a good head and 30 years of other people's worst days behind his eyes. He read it twice. I watched him read it twice. Then he set it down and squared it with 2 fingers and said, "When was this lodged?" 3 weeks ago, my lord. By whom was it received? I could have lied. It would have been very easy, and there were 4 people it could plausibly have been. By me, my lord. He looked at me then. 26 years I had sat below that man and handed him his papers, and I do not think he had ever properly looked at me before that moment. You did not read it? No, my lord. Why not? Because I was busy, my lord, and it was a form, and forms are what one initials. He was quiet for a while. Out of the window you could see the yard and the vans and the flat gray light of a country in the middle of March. Well, he said at last, that is honest at least. My lord, I will go down to the cells and... You will do nothing of the kind. I stopped. He turned round, and I saw, and I have never forgotten it, that he was not softened. He had gone the other way. He had read the paper and it had frightened him, and a frightened proud man does not bend, he sets. Mr. Fenn, he said, let us be very clear about what this document is and is not. It is a fact. It establishes that the color sergeant is unable to stand. Very well. I accept it without reservation, and I am sorry for him. But the contempt of this court was not his inability. The contempt was his asterisk refusal to say so. He was asked 4 times. He had a mouth. He had a voice, which is more than the poor young man in the gallery has got. He chose to sit in my court and let me hang myself in front of 200 people, and he chose it deliberately, because he wanted the spectacle, and now he will have it. My lord, I don't believe that's. You do not believe. You are the clerk. You do not believe anything in this room. You record it. He said it not unkindly. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said to himself for 40 years. A certificate is a fact. Contempt is a choice. He made his choice with his eyes open. He will apologize at 4 o'clock, and I will release him, and the matter will end there, and we will get on with the business of a boy whose jaw was broken by a man who is at this moment, I have no doubt whatsoever, eating a very good lunch. He picked up his wig. And Mr. Fenn. My lord. Read the next one. They put him in the third cell on the left, which is the one with the wide door, and Beaton Gile went down at midday with a cup of tea from his own flask, because the court tea is not fit to give a soldier, and Gile told me afterward, Gile told everyone afterward for the rest of his life, what he found. He found Color Sergeant Ashgrove with his bearskin balanced on his knees and a soft cloth in his hand, going over the brass of his tunic buttons, one at a time, in a police cell in the dark, with nobody to see him. You don't have to do that down here, Sergeant, Giles said. And Ashgrove said without looking up, I'll be going back up, Mr. Gile. It'd be a poor thing to go back up untidy. At 2 o'clock the court sat again, and Mr. Havern Seath rose to continue his plea in mitigation, and within 90 seconds I understood that the morning had not been a disaster. It had been a gift, and Seath had unwrapped it over lunch. My lord, he said, in that low, regretful, reasonable voice that has emptied more docks than any argument ever made, I hesitate to touch upon what occurred in this court this morning. It is not my business, and I intend no discourtesy to a regiment for which I have, as I think everyone in this room knows, the very highest regard. My own uncle served, but your lordship will forgive me if I say that it has a bearing. Say what you mean, Mr. Seath. I mean this, my lord. My learned friend for the crown invites your lordship to sentence my client on the basis that he inflicted an asterisk indignity. That is her word, my lord, indignity. Upon an institution, upon a uniform, upon, as she puts it, the honor of the King's Guard, and your lordship has this morning had the opportunity, unsought and I am sure unwelcome, to observe at first hand the attitude which that institution takes toward the honor of this asterisk court. I saw Miss Adeline Margot very still at the Crown's end of the bench. She is the best of them, and she does not rattle, and she went still the way a cat goes still. A senior non-commissioned officer of that regiment, Seath went on, sat in the front row of your lordship's court in the full dress of his corps and declined, 4 times, my lord, 4 times on the record, to afford your lordship the ordinary courtesy that a costermonger affords a magistrate. He would not stand. He would not explain. He preferred the cells. He is unable to stand, Mr. Seath. And here I have thought about this a great deal. Here Mr. Justice Devereux made his second mistake, which was to answer. Because Seath spread his hands and said, with enormous gentleness, then he might have said so, my lord, might he not? A single sentence, and your lordship would have been the first to accommodate him. Instead he chose silence, chose it, my lord, as a weapon in a court of law in front of the press. And I say with the greatest respect that this is precisely the mentality which the Crown asks your lordship to reward today. The mentality that will not speak, will not react, will not engage, and then presents its own silence as a wound and asks the court to pay for it. He let that sit. He is very good, Seath. He is a bad man, and he is very good. My lord, Private Wren did not react. That is agreed. The Crown relies on it. He did not flinch, he did not speak, he did not fall. And the Crown now says, because he did not react, he was profoundly injured. But if silence is a wound, my lord, then this morning your lordship was wounded 4 times, and the color sergeant is in a cell for it. And if silence is not a wound, if it is, as the regiment plainly holds it to be, a form of strength, an armor, then my client, who is a foolish young man and no worse, gave nothing to Private Wren but a bruise on a jaw, for which he is sorry, and for which a fine and a period of unpaid work would be an ample and an asterisk proportionate answer. And he sat down. I looked at my hands on the desk, and I found that I had broken the nib of my pen. This is the point at which I should stop being the clerk for a moment and tell you who Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove was, because Seath had just spent 10 minutes explaining to a courtroom who he was, and every word of it was a lie, and only 3 people in the building knew it, and none of them were in the room. I did not know it either that afternoon. I learned it in pieces, the way you learn anything true. The first piece came from Giles, in the corridor at the break. "He's got no business being in a cell," Giles said. He was standing with his hands behind his back, staring at nothing, and his voice was shaking, which I had never heard in 40 years. "Mr. Fenn, he had the depot in this morning." "He had the what?" "The depot, the recruits, before court. 5:30 this morning, Mr. Fenn, out at the barracks. He had 30 of them on the square." Giles looked at me. "He's not retired, sir. He's not a pensioner they've wheeled in for the day to be looked at. He's the master of the colors. He's the man who trains them. Every guardsman who stood outside that palace for the last 9 years learned how to stand from him." I said something stupid, I said, "But he can't stand." And Giles, who had opened doors in that building for 4 decades, and had never in my hearing said a sharp word to a living soul, turned round and looked at me with something on his face I did not recognize until much later, when I found it on my own. "No, sir," he said, "he can't." "That's rather the point, isn't it?" The second piece came from the boy. At the afternoon adjournment, I went up to the gallery, because there was nobody else to do it, and because I had a piece of paper in my pocket with my own initials on it, and I could not sit still. Private Ivo Wren was where he had been all day in the second row, hands folded. Up close he was younger than 19 and older than 19 at the same time, the way they are. I told him who I was, and that the color sergeant was well and had been given tea and was not being ill-used. He nodded, then he took his little pad and wrote and turned it round. "He will not apologize. Don't let them ask him twice." I read it. I said, "The judge will release him this evening if he purges the contempt." "It is 1 sentence, Private. It costs him nothing." Wren's eyes came up. He wrote again, faster, pressing hard enough to score the page. "It costs him everything. He hasn't asked anyone for anything in 11 years. I said, and I'm ashamed of it, I said, 11 years. He looked at me for a long moment, and then something went out of his face, and he wrote one more line and turned the pad, and it said, "You people really don't know." And he stood up and went out of the gallery, because he could not say the rest of it, and even if his jaw had been whole, I do not think he would have said it to me. The third piece I found myself, at 3:30. Rule 11 certificates are lodged with a supporting document, where one exists, and I had not read the certificate, so I had not seen what was stapled to the back of it. When I went down to the records room and turned the paper over, there was a second sheet. A photocopy, the record of a citation, and at the top of it, in the flat, unlovely typeface of the Crown's own printers, "The Cross of Valor, Register of the Order, Volume 9, Folio 212. I did not read it there. I want that on the record too, because it is the single decision of that day I do not regret. I stood with it in my hand, and I understood, in a way I cannot properly describe, that this was not mine to read alone in a cupboard. Some things are not evidence. Some things are a debt, and a debt is paid in front of people. I put it in my inside pocket and went upstairs and sat down below the bench, and at 4 o'clock they brought Color Sergeant Ashgrove back into court number 1. He came in with his buttons shining. Of course he did. They had offered to push him. Giles told me afterward that the 2 officers on the cells had offered, and had meant it kindly, and that Ashgrove had said, "Thank you, no," in a tone that ended the conversation forever, and had come up the ramp and along the corridor and into the court on his own arms, at his own pace, and had settled himself in the space at the end of the front bench and put his bearskin on his lap and squared his shoulders and waited. The public gallery was full. It had not been full in the morning. It was full now, and there were 4 reporters in the press box where there had been 1, and I understood that the world outside had found us. "Color Sergeant Ashgrove," said Mr. Justice Deverell. "My lord, I have this afternoon been provided with a certificate lodged under Rule 11 of the practice rules of this assize. It was lodged 3 weeks ago. It ought to have been before me this morning, and it was not, and that failure is the failure of this court, for which I apologize to you without qualification." He said it clearly, and he said it without a scrap of grudge, and I will hold that to his credit until I die. "The certificate establishes," he went on, "that you are permanently unable to rise. I accept it. Let it be recorded that this court accepts it, that no discourtesy was intended by you in remaining seated, and that no inference of disrespect is drawn or is to be drawn by anyone, in this building or outside it, from the fact that you sat while I addressed you." He paused. "That, however, is not the whole of the matter." And I closed my eyes. "You were asked this morning 4 times why you would not stand. You had an answer. It was a complete answer, it was an honorable answer, and it was in your gift. You withheld it. You permitted this court and me personally to proceed into an error which 1 sentence from you would have prevented knowing, as a man of 21 years' service must have known, precisely what would be made of it by the newspapers who are, as you can see, now with us. That is what I found to be a contempt, not your infirmity, your silence. Now, I have no wish to keep a soldier of the king in a cell overnight, and I take no pleasure in any part of this. Tell me you meant no defiance of this court, and the contempt is purged, and you go home tonight, and I will hear the statement you came here to read, and we will get on." He leaned forward. "That is all I want, Color Sergeant. 1 sentence." And there was a silence in court number 1, like the silence in a house when the clock stops. Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove sat with his gloved hands on the crown of his bearskin and looked up at the bench, and when he spoke his voice was exactly as it had been at 11 minutes past 10, which is to say level, unhurried, and entirely without heat. "My lord," he said, "I cannot give you that sentence, and I would like to tell you why if the court will permit me. It will take less time than the alternative." "Go on." "You say my silence was a choice. It was. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not hide behind a doctor's paper. I chose it, and I would choose it again this evening. My lord, if I had answered you this morning, I would have been buying something. I would have been offering this court an account of my body in exchange for its good opinion. And I have watched men do that, good men, better men than me, who learned to lead with the worst thing that ever happened to them because they found out it opens doors. After a while, nobody sees the soldier. They only see the wound. And then the man begins to see only the wound too, and then there is no man there at all, and he is not coming back. I have been a color sergeant for 11 years in this condition. I have trained 600 guardsmen. Not one of them has ever heard me explain myself, and I will not begin in a public court in front of a man in the dock who thinks a broken jaw is amusing. And there is this, my lord, and it is the greater part of it. If I must produce a certificate before I am spoken to as a man, what happens to the next man who comes into this room without one? The one with no regimental surgeon, no letterhead, no colonel, no cross to put on the table. He will be told to stand as I was told, and he will have nothing in his pocket, and he will sit there and be looked at like a rude man, and he will go home and never come back to a court again as long as he lives. I am not the man who needs protecting from you, my lord. I am the only man in this building today who could afford to say nothing, so I said nothing, and I would ask the court to understand that as service, because that is what it was. Nobody moved. As to defiance, he said. "I have never defied this court, and I do not defy it now. I will pay the fine. If your lordship requires the night, I will take the night. But I will not apologize for sitting down, my lord. Not because I am proud, because there is a 19-year-old boy in that gallery with his mouth wired shut who has spent 9 weeks being told by clever men that what was done to him does not count, because he did not react. And if I stand here today and apologize for not reacting—" He stopped. It was the only time all day that he stopped. "Then I have handed them the boy," he said, "and I did not come here to hand them the boy." Mr. Justice Devereux sat back in his chair. "I have watched that man take an argument apart the way a butcher takes apart a carcass, and I had never once seen him take as long as he took then. 30 seconds, 40. The court did not breathe. In the dock Kester male was smiling faintly at his shoes, which I only mention because it was the last time that day he smiled. And then Coram Devereux did the thing that has made me, ever since, unable to hate him. He said, in a voice that had gone quite thin, 'That is the finest speech that has been made in this court in 10 years, Color Sergeant, and it does not answer me.' No, my lord, I know it doesn't. You are telling me why you chose silence. You are not telling me that you did not choose it. No, my lord. Then I am left where I was." The judge looked down at his notes and did not see them. A court cannot survive on the good character of the people who come into it. It survives on the rule. And the rule is that a man who is asked a question by a judge answers it, and a man who does not is in contempt. And if I make an exception for a soldier with a cross in his file this afternoon, then I have no answer at all for the next thief who tells me he had a principal asterisk. He said it like a man reading his own sentence, and I think that is what it was. "The contempt stands," said Mr. Justice Devereux. "You will spend the night. You will be brought up at 10 tomorrow, and I will ask you again. And I would ask you, Color Sergeant, in the hours between, to think about the fact that there is a young man in the gallery who needs his statement read, and only one person in this realm who is permitted to read it, and he has decided to be in a cell." And I heard from the second row of the public gallery a sound, not a word, not quite a shout, the sound a boy makes when his jaw is wired and there is something he would give his right arm to be able to say. I did not sleep. I sat up in my kitchen with the photocopy from folio 212 face down on the table in front of me, and I did not turn it over, and I could not have told you then why. I think now it was because I knew that once I read it I would have to do something, and I had spent 31 years being a man whose entire professional virtue was that he did not do things. The clerk does not intervene. The clerk records. And I had put him in that cell, not the judge. Me, with a pot of tea in one hand and a pen in the other, 3 weeks earlier in the space of 4 seconds. I turned the photocopy over at 3 o'clock and read folio 212 of the Register of the Order, and then I sat with my hands flat on my kitchen table for a very long time. At 6 I shaved and put on a clean collar and went to work. The realm found out overnight. It was not the reporters who did it in the end. It was a woman in the public gallery with a telephone and 11 minutes of patience, who had written down what Ashgrove said about the next man with nothing in his pocket, and put it out into the world before her bus reached her street. By the time I came up the steps of the assize at 7:30, there were 200 people on the pavement. They were not shouting. I want that understood, because a great deal was made afterward of an mob at the doors of the court, and there was no mob. There were 200 people standing in the cold in a straight line along the railings, and about a third of them were in the uniform of the King's Guard, off-duty in dress, without arms, which they had every right to be, and they were standing at ease and they were not making a sound. They had come to stand outside a building, because a man inside it could not. I walked past them and I could not look at them, and one of them, an enormous young lance corporal with a face like a boiled ham, said, "Morning, sir," very politely, and held the gate for me. And that was worse than anything they could have shouted. Court number 1 at 10 o'clock was a different country. Every seat in the gallery was taken, and there were people standing 3 deep against the back rail. The press box had 11 in it and 2 more on the steps. There were faces I had never seen in that room and would never see again, old men mostly, and some old women, sitting with their hats in their laps in the particular way that people sit when they have come somewhere they consider serious. And at the front, the seat with the card on it that said reserved Colonel-in-Chief, King's Guard. Still empty. They brought Color Sergeant Ashgrove up at 4 minutes past 10. He had shaved. I do not know how, and I never asked. His collar was straight, and his brass was as it had been the day before, and he came up the ramp under his own arms and took his place at the end of the front bench and set his bearskin on his lap. There was a sound in that gallery when he came in. It was not applause. Giles would have stopped applause and did, 3 times that morning, with one raised finger. It was the sound of 200 people drawing a breath at the same moment. "All rise," said Bedun Giles. And every soul in court number 1 rose, and Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove sat, with his back straight and his eyes forward, exactly as he had sat the day before. And Mr. Justice Devereux came in and looked at him, and looked away. "My lord," said Miss Adeline Marr, before the judge had so much as reached for his pen, "before your lordship returns to the matter of the contempt, the Crown has an application." "Miss Marr, I have not." "It is an application in the sentencing exercise, my lord, and I would ask to make it now, because it bears directly upon everything that has happened in this court since yesterday morning, and I say it would be a grave misfortune if any further step were taken without it." Devereux put down his pen. "Very well. My lord, your lordship has been shown a clip of footage lasting 52 seconds, the footage that has been on every telephone in the realm. It begins 4 seconds before the defendant strikes Private Wren, and ends when the corporal of the guard reaches him. That clip was uploaded by the defendant. It was *edited by the defendant. The Crown has, in the unused material, the unedited file recovered from his device, which runs to 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It has been served on the defense. It has not been played in this court, because until yesterday morning the Crown could see no purpose in playing it. She let that hang for exactly as long as she needed to. The Crown now sees a purpose, my lord." Havern Seath was on his feet like a man stung. "My lord, this is quite improper. The material is unused. My client has pleaded. We are in mitigation, and my learned friend proposes to import into the sentencing exercise a piece of film which she herself has never—" "Sit down, Mr. Seath," said Mr. Justice Devereux. "My lord." "Sit down." Seath sat down. "Miss Marr," said the judge, "what is on the film?" And Adeline Marr, who is the best of them, said, 2 minutes and 11 seconds before the assault, my lord, the defendant walks past the north gate of the palace, and he passes a man in a wheelchair, and he stops, and he films him, and he says something. I would ask that your lordship hear it in the defendant's own voice." They set the screen at an angle so the gallery could see it, which is a thing we do at the assize, and which I have always thought a small piece of quiet decency. The picture came up. A bright cold afternoon at the north gate, the railings, the crowd, phones held up like a hedge, the camera swinging. And then it stopped swinging. He was there. At the edge of the frame, just inside the railings in the shadow of the gatehouse, a man in scarlet in a chair, not on display, not being wheeled about, working. You could see it if you knew what you were looking at, and I did not know that first time, and then Marr had it played again, and I did. He was watching the sentry. That is all. He was watching a 19-year-old boy stand a post, with his hands folded on his lap and his head absolutely still, and every 40 seconds or so his eyes went along the line of the boy from the boots to the chin strap, and once, you can see it on the second viewing when you are looking for it, he made a very small movement with the first 2 fingers of his right hand, downward, a half-inch, no more. Chin down. And 2 seconds later, at the far end of the frame, the boy's chin came down. That is what a master of the colors does at a gate on a cold afternoon. He watches. He corrects. He is not a decoration, and he is not a poor unfortunate that a kind regiment has found a corner for. He is the standard by which the other men are measured, and the men know it, and they stand better when he is there, and he was there. And into the frame walked Kester Mayle. The court heard him laugh first. Then the camera turned and found the man in the chair and steadied on him, held on him for 9 seconds, which is a very long time. Go and count 9 seconds now, and you will see how long. And Kester Mayle's voice, close to the microphone, warm with the pleasure of a man performing for people he cannot see, said, "Oh, look at that asterisk. Look what they've got by the gate. They've wheeled out the broken one. That's the honor of the regiment, that is. 20 years of standing about, and they park you by the bins so the tourists can take a picture." Somebody in the gallery made a noise. The camera came in closer, and in the middle of the frame, filling it, was a face I had watched for a day and a half and had never once seen change. It did not change now. He knew he was being filmed. He knew exactly what was being said. He looked front at his sentry, and his hand stayed folded, and he let it come off him the way rain comes off a slate roof, because that is the entire discipline, and he had been the one who taught it. And Kester Mayle, disappointed because they are always disappointed, said the last thing. He said, "Can't even stand up for the king." And he laughed and he walked on, and 2 minutes and 11 seconds later he broke a boy's jaw. The screen went dark. Nobody in court number 1 moved. I have been in that room for 31 years, and I have heard verdicts of murder returned in it, and I have never heard a silence with that weight in it. And I did what everyone else did, which was to look up at the bench. Mr. Justice Coram Deverell had not moved either. His hands were flat on the blotter. His face had no expression at all, and he was looking at the dark screen the way a man looks at a road accident he cannot remember causing. Can't even stand up. He had said it himself, not those words, but he had said stand up in that room twice, 3 times 4. He had said unable or unwilling. He had said you have a mouth asterisk. He had built the same sentence out of the same brick and laid it in front of the same man from his own bench, in the name of the law he had given his life to, and 200 people had just heard a man in a dock say the shorter, cruder version of it, and had heard the room recoil. I watched it arrive. And there was one moment, in which Coram Deverell could have set it all down. He could have said, "I was wrong," 2 words. He was still holding at that instant everything he needed to say them. But a proud man does not fall in the direction he is being pushed. And Coram Deverell had spent 44 years, since he was 17, and holding a door for barristers who did not learn his name, teaching himself never to be moved by a room. So he did not say it. He picked up his pen. His hand was not entirely steady, and he saw it, and he put the pen down again and folded his hands. "That footage," he said, "is now part of the record of these proceedings and will be considered by me in due course in the sentencing of the defendant. Mr. Seath, you will have your opportunity to address me upon it." He turned a page that did not need turning. The matter of the contempt is a separate matter and is not affected by it. Color Sergeant Ashgrove. I felt the whole gallery move. "My lord, you have had the night. I ask you again, and I ask you for the last time, do you tell this court that you intended it no defiance?" And Color Sergeant Ashgrove said, in that same level, unhurried voice, without one grain of triumph in it, which is the thing I would want you to understand about him if you understand nothing else. "I intended this court no defiance, my lord. I have never intended it any. I will not apologize for remaining seated, because I have done nothing that requires an apology, and if I say the words to get out of a cell, then they are not true words, and a court is not helped by untrue words. I am content to remain where I am. You are content. I am, my lord. I've slept in worse, and the cells here are warm. Somebody in the gallery laughed, one bark, half a sob in it, and Giles raised his finger and it stopped. And Mr. Justice Devereux looked out over a courtroom that was, for the first time in 26 years, entirely and openly against him, and did the only thing left to a proud man who has begun to fall and will not be seen to. This court, he said, is not governed by the mob. He raised his voice, which he almost never did. There are 200 people on the pavement outside this building and 11 gentlemen of the press in that box, and I am told that what happens in this room is now the property of every telephone in the realm. It is not. It is the property of the law. I will not be told what to do by a crowd, and I will not be told what to do by a newspaper, and I will not have this court turned into a theater. Mr. Giles, clear the public gallery. Beadon Giles had been an usher of the assize of Harrogate for 40 years, and had never once, to my knowledge, hesitated over an order from the bench. He hesitated then. It was not a rebellion. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and nobody but I saw it, because nobody but I was watching him instead of the judge. He stood at the door with his hand on the brass, and his shoulders came up, and he looked at the man in the wheelchair at the end of the front bench. And Color Sergeant Ashgrove, without turning his head, said one word to him, quietly. I was 6 feet away and I heard it. Duty. And Beadon Giles' shoulders came down, and he opened the door and he cleared the gallery. They went, all of them. 200 people got up and filed out of court number 1 in a silence you could have carried water in, and not one of them said a word, and not one of them looked at the bench. They looked at Ashgrove. Every single one of them, going past the rail, looked at the man in the red coat sitting in the space where a chair should have been. And he did not look back at them, because he was on duty in his way, and because he was not going to give them the moment they wanted, and because I think if he had looked at them, he would not have been able to keep his face. The doors closed. Court number 1 held 11 reporters, 4 barristers, a defendant, a judge, a clerk, an usher, a boy with a wired jaw who had refused to move and whom nobody had the heart to make move, and a color sergeant. Now, said Mr. Justice Devereux, in a room with all the air let out of it, we will proceed. I asked for the short adjournment myself. That is not something a clerk does. In 31 years I had asked for exactly nothing. But I stood up and I said, My lord, if the court pleases, there is a matter arising on the record which I must lay before your lordship, and I would ask for 15 minutes to put it in order. And Corin Devereux looked at me for a long moment with his hand halfway to his pen, and something in my face must have been unfamiliar to him, because he said, 15 minutes. And I went out into the corridor. They had not gone home. The gallery had been cleared, and they had come down the stairs and out through the great doors and had gone 11 feet, to the pavement, and there they had stopped, and turned round and stood facing the building. By 11 o'clock there were 400 of them. By noon there were more than I could count from a window, and the police had shut the street to traffic, and there was still no shouting. There were guardsmen in it, in scarlet, standing with their hats under their arms, old soldiers in blazers with medals, and a great many people who were not soldiers at all, standing in the cold in their ordinary coats in the middle of a working Tuesday. I went out to them. I do not know what I thought I was doing. There was a woman near the railings, 60-odd, a green coat, a plastic rain hood folded in her hand, although it was not raining, the whole look of a woman who had come out of her house in a hurry and had not stopped to think about it. I said, Madam, forgive me, I'm the clerk of the court. Might I ask why you're here? She looked at me as though I had asked her why she had lungs. Because he's in there, she said. You know him. No, she shook her head. No, I've never spoken to him in my life. Then, and she said, quite matter-of-factly, the way you would tell a man the time. I walked out under him. I did not understand, I said so. And she turned and looked up at the great gray face of the assize, and she said, Lantern night, 11 years ago, the stand at the river gate. I was on the top tier with my sister and her husband. When it started to go, everybody went for the one exit and the frame came down across it, that iron frame, the whole gantry with the lamps on it, and it jammed the gate about so high. She held her hand at the level of her chest. And there was 600 of us in there and one way out. She stopped and pressed her mouth into a line and got herself back. And a boy in a red coat put himself under it, she said. In the gap. On his hands and his back and his shoulders in the gap, and he lifted, and he made it about so high, and she raised her hand, and her hand was shaking, and she raised it to the height of a door, and he held it there. And we went out under him, one at a time, 600 of us, old women, my sister's husband on a stick. I went out under him and I could see his face, and he had his eyes shut, and he was counting. He was counting us. He didn't say get out or hurry or anything. He counted us. I heard him. I was 190-something, and I have never once in 11 years been able to remember the number, and I would give anything to remember the number. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, briskly, as though it were an inconvenience. He held it for 11 minutes, she said, and when the last of us was through, he let go, and then they had to get him out. I said, and my own voice sounded like it belonged to another man, and he never said a word about it, said the woman. Not to a newspaper, not to anybody. They gave him the cross and he didn't go to the palace to get it, they had to send it. My sister wrote to him. He wrote back one line saying he was glad she was well. That's all any of us ever got. And now I'm told he's in a cell in that building because he wouldn't stand up. She turned and looked at me and her chin came up. Well, he can't, can he? He gave it away. He gave it away holding a gate open for me. I went back inside. The corridor outside court number 1 was full of guardsmen. Not blocking it, they had left a clear lane down the middle, because they are what they are, but full, standing along both walls in dress, in silence, and at the head of them a warrant officer with a face like a closed door who put himself in front of me. Sir, is he all right? Yes, he's well. The warrant officer nodded once and did not move. We're not here to make trouble, sir, he said. You tell the judge, nobody's going to make any trouble. We're just going to be here. At 20-1, the doors at the end of the corridor opened, and every man along those walls came to attention in one movement, and the sound of it went through that old building like a shot. Princess Adela had arrived. She was colonel-in-chief of the King's Guard, and she had been for 19 years, and she came up the corridor in a plain dark coat with a single regimental brooch at the collar and nothing else about her that said anything at all. She was not young. She walked fast. She had 2 people with her, one of whom carried a flat leather case under his arm, and she went past the guardsmen without a word to any of them, and every one of them, as she passed, was staring straight ahead at the opposite wall with his chin up and his eyes bright. She stopped in front of me. You are the clerk. Fenn, ma'am, Elias Fenn. Mr. Fenn, is Color Sergeant Ashgrove still in custody? He is, ma'am. Has he asked for anything at all? No, ma'am. He asked for the boy's statement to be read. That's all he's asked for twice, and he asked to be allowed to go back to his recruits at 5:30 this morning, and when he was told he could not, he said, and I had to stop and clear my throat, he said, very well, and then he asked whether somebody could telephone the depot so the men would not think he had simply failed to turn up. Princess Adela looked at me for a moment. Yes, she said. That will be him. And she went into court number 1, and she walked down the aisle, and she sat down in the front bench in the seat with the card on it, next to the space where the chair had been taken away. "My lord," she said when the court sat, "I am the colonel-in-chief of the King's Guard. I am not a lawyer, and I do not intend to behave like one. I ask leave to address the court on one point only, and I will be brief, and then I will sit down and be quiet for as long as your lordship requires." Corin Ashgrove looked at her the way a man looks at the last wave coming in. "The seat you observed to be empty yesterday morning," he said, "was yours." "It was, my lord. I was on the far side of the realm, and I could not be here, and I sent instead the man whose word in my regiment is worth more than mine, and I apologize to this court for my absence, and I do not apologize for my choice." "Say your point, ma'am." "My lord, my point is a matter of record and not of sentiment, and I would be grateful if the court would hold me to that, because I am very angry and I do not wish it to show." And she opened the flat leather case and took out a single sheet. "On the 12th of March, 11 years ago," said Princess Adela, "the Crown entered a citation in the Register of the Order of the Cross of Valor, Volume 9, Folio 212. It is a public document. It has been a public document for 11 years. It is available in the library of this building, on the second floor, 40 feet above your lordship's head, and it has been there the entire time this court has been asking that man why he will not stand. I tender it to the court." There was a long pause. "Ma'am," said Mr. Justice Devereux, "I have already accepted the certificate. I have accepted that he cannot rise. Nothing turns on." "My lord," said Princess Adela, "you have accepted that he cannot. You have not been told what he did asterisk. And this court has spent 2 days asking that question out loud in public of the only man in the realm who was never going to answer it. Somebody in this room is going to answer it. And it will not be me, because it is not mine to tell, and it will not be him, because he would rather sit in your cells until the roof falls in. So I tender the record, and I ask that the record be read. And here the forms of the court, the forms that Corin Ashgrove had spent his whole life building himself into, the ribs of the ship closed around him like a hand. Because there is a practice in that building older than the building. It is not in any rule book. Nobody has ever needed to write it down. When a citation of the Cross of Valor is tendered to a court of the realm, it is not marked as an exhibit and passed along the bench and glanced at. It is read asterisk, aloud, in open court, by the court itself. It is read that way because that is what the honor is for. A decoration is not a thing a man wears. It is a sentence the realm has written about him, and the realm undertakes, when it writes it, to say it out loud whenever it is asked to. Havern Seath knew it. I saw his face and he knew it. Adeline Mar knew it. And Corin Ashgrove, who knew every form in that building better than he knew his own children, sat on the bench and understood that there was no door. "Mr. Fenn," he said. "My lord." "The document." I went to the front bench, and Princess Adela put the sheet into my hand, and I carried it up to the bench, and I laid it on the blotter in front of Mr. Justice Devereux. And then, and I have never known what made me do it, and I have decided in my old age not to inquire too closely, I did not go back down. I stayed where I was, at the judge's elbow, and I took out of my inside pocket the photocopy that had been face down on my kitchen table since 3 o'clock that morning, and I laid it beside the other. "That is the office copy, my lord," I said. "It was stapled to the certificate. It has been in my file for 3 weeks. He looked at it. He looked at my initials in the corner. "You had it," he said, "the whole time." "Yes, my lord, we both did." And Corin Ashgrove closed his eyes for perhaps 2 seconds, and then he opened them, and he took up the sheet, and he began to read. "Register of the Order of the Cross of Valor," he read. "Volume 9, Folio 212. Guardsman Corin Ashgrove, King's Guard." His voice was steady. It is a good voice, a court voice, trained for 30 years to carry to the back of a room without effort. On the night of the Feast of Lanterns, at the temporary grandstand erected at the river gate, a lamp gantry above the eastern stair failed and fell across the only exit from the upper tiers. The structure came to rest at a height of some 4 feet, obstructing the gate. 611 persons were on the tiers above. The stand was by then on fire in 2 places, and the remaining stairways were impassable. He turned the sheet over. Nobody in court number 1 had moved. Guardsman Ashgrove, who was a member of the cordon and under no duty to enter the structure, went in against the movement of the crowd. Finding the gate obstructed and the crowd beginning to press, he placed himself beneath the fallen gantry and raised it, and held it raised, at a height sufficient to permit persons to pass beneath it upright. He held it for 11 minutes. 611 persons passed out of the grandstand beneath him. He is recorded by 17 witnesses as having counted them aloud as they passed, and as having called out no other word. He did not release the weight until the corporal of the cordon informed him that the tiers were clear. He was then unable to withdraw, and the weight was cut away from him. Corin Ashgrove stopped. I was standing close enough to see the sheet in his hands, and I watched the edge of it begin to move. The injuries he sustained, he read, were to his spine, and they are permanent, and they are the reason he cannot stand, and he has never referred to them. That is not what the citation says. I have the copy still, and I know exactly what it says, and it says, in the flat language of the register, he sustained injuries from which he has not recovered, and to which he has never referred. Corin Ashgrove put the other words in himself. He put them in aloud in his own court, in his own voice on the record, and his voice came apart in the middle of them, and he heard it come apart, and he did not stop. The cross, he finished, is conferred not for the strength of the act but for its length. Any man may lift. This man did not put it down. He set the sheet on the blotter and squared it with 2 fingers, because that was what his hands knew how to do. And then Mr. Justice Corin Ashgrove sat in perfect silence in front of a defendant, 4 barristers, 11 reporters, a boy with a wired jaw, a princess, an usher, a clerk, and a color sergeant of the King's Guard, and did not trust himself to speak for 11 seconds. I counted them. I have counted a great many things in that room. 11. Color Sergeant Ashgrove, he said at last. My lord, have you anything to say? And Corin Ashgrove, and I would ask you to remember here that this was a man who had spent 30 hours in a cell and had been told from the highest seat in the room that he was a discourtesy, and who was now sitting in a courtroom that had just been made to look at him properly for the first time in 11 years, said, Yes, my lord, I would rather you had not read it. Nobody in that room breathed. I know the court meant it kindly, he said, and I will not be discourteous to Her Highness, who did what she thought was right and who has never in 19 years done otherwise. But my lord, I have to tell you what has just happened in this room because I do not think anybody else in it will. 10 minutes ago this was the sentencing of a man who broke a boy's jaw. It is not that anymore. It is now a story about me. It will be in every newspaper in the realm tomorrow morning, and it will have my name in it and the word *hero in it. And there will not be one line in it about Private Ivo Wren, who is sitting behind me, who has not eaten solid food for 9 weeks, and who has to go back and stand a post at that gate in a fortnight, in front of the same people on the same stone, and take whatever comes next. That is what my cross has just bought him. Nothing. It has taken his case away from him and given it to a color sergeant in a chair, which is exactly what I have spent 11 years making certain never to do to anybody. I told the court yesterday that I would not trade my injuries for its good opinion. I did not trade them today either. They were taken from my pocket and spent by other people. I do not blame them for it, but I will not be paid out of it, my lord, and neither will he. He shifted his gloved hands a half-inch on the crown of the bearskin. It was the largest movement I had seen him make in 2 days. "So I would ask this court to do one thing," said Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove. "Put it back where it was. Forget the 11 minutes I have. Forget the gate. It fell down 11 years ago and it is not coming back up. Send me to the cells tonight if the law requires it, and I will go, and I will not complain. But before you do, my lord, the boy's statement is 4 pages, and it is on your clerk's desk, and it has been there since 11 minutes past 10 yesterday morning, and nobody in this building has read a word of it. Let me read it. That is the whole of what I came here for. I have not asked this court for anything else, and I am not going to." Mr. Justice Devereux looked down at him for a long moment. Then he said, and this is the moment I would choose, if I were only allowed one, to describe the man he actually was underneath 26 years of ermine and pride. "Color Sergeant, I am going to say something to you, and I am going to say it before I deal with anything else, because if I leave it until later it will look like a decoration on a judgment, and it is not a decoration. It is the judgment. This court was wrong. Not mistaken, not misinformed, wrong. A certificate was lodged and this court did not read it. That is a failure of the office, and the office is mine. But that is the smaller half, and I will not hide behind it. The larger half is this. I looked at a man who did not stand, and without one particle of evidence I decided what kind of man he was. I have spent my whole working life telling barristers that the law is the enemy of assumption, and I sat up here and I assumed. I did not need the cross to tell me I was wrong. I have known it since a piece of film played in this court an hour ago, and I heard a man in the dock say, in coarser language, precisely what I had said from this bench. I knew it then, and I did not say it, because I am a proud man and did not wish to be seen to be pushed. That is on the record now, and I would rather it came from my own mouth than out of a newspaper. The finding of contempt is vacated. It is expunged. It was not a lawful contempt, and it was not a just one. The fine is remitted, and the night in the cells of this building is on my conscience and will remain there, and I do not ask you to relieve me of it. I apologize to you, Color Sergeant Ashgrove, not as the court. As a man of 61 who ought to have known better, and who was taught better by his father, who spent 40 years holding doors. And Color Sergeant Ashgrove inclined his head just that, the movement a man makes at a color when it passes, and said, "My lord." "Now," said Coram Devereux, and picked up his pen, and his hand was quite steady, "read me the statement." He read it in the voice he would have used to read a duty roster, which is the only way that statement could have been survived by anybody in that room. 4 pages, in a 19-year-old's handwriting, written with a pencil over 9 days because he could not speak. It did not ask for anything. It did not accuse anybody. Half of it was about the drill, about what a sentry is actually doing in the 4 seconds between one movement and the next, and what it costs, and how he had been taught that the whole point of not reacting is that the moment you react, you have made yourself the story instead of the thing you are standing in front of. And near the end, there was a line I have never forgotten, and neither has anyone else who was in court number 1 that afternoon, and it was this. I did not move because moving is the only thing I had that he could not take, so I kept it. And then I found out that everybody thought that minute did not hurt. Color Sergeant Ashgrove read that line without a tremor and set the page down and said, "That is the statement of Private Ivo Wren, my lord," and folded his hands. And in the second row of an empty public gallery, one boy sat by himself with his jaw wired shut and cried, and Beaton Gile went and stood beside him and did not say anything, and did not make him leave. Kester Mayle was sentenced at 4 o'clock. I will not give you the whole of it. It ran to 20 minutes, and it is reported in the law books and taught now to young barristers, which would have made Coram Devereux laugh in a way I would not have wanted to hear. He said that the defense had been built on the proposition that a disciplined man cannot be dishonored, and that the court rejected it with contempt. He said that stillness is not consent, that silence is not permission, and that a man who reads another man's restraint as an invitation has told the court everything it needs to know about himself. He said Private Wren's failure to react was the strongest evidence in the case of what had been taken from him, not the weakest. And he said, without looking up, that this court had made the identical error 2 days earlier in public, and had therefore no excuse whatever for failing to recognize it now. Then he passed a custodial sentence, of a length that surprised the press box and did not surprise me, and he ordered that the 6 minutes and 40 seconds be retained on the record in full. Kester Mayle went down the stairs from the dock without any of his admirers, and was gone. And then Mr. Justice Devereux closed his notebook and said, "Mr. Gile." Bedon Gile came to the middle of the floor and put his heels together, and opened his mouth to say the words he had said perhaps 40,000 times in that building, the words his father said before him. And he could not say them. He stood there in the middle of court number 1 with his mouth open, and his eyes streaming and 40 years of service in his throat, and he could not get out "all rise." So Mr. Justice Coram Devereux got up off the bench himself. He came down the 2 steps to the floor of the court, which no judge does, and he stood in front of the end of the front bench, in front of a man in a scarlet tunic with a bearskin on his lap, and he said, to a room of perhaps 20 people, "This court will rise." And everyone rose. The barristers, the reporters, the police officers by the door, the princess, the usher, the boy in the gallery, and the clerk. And Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove sat, with his back straight and his eyes forward, and his hands still on the crown of his bearskin, exactly as he had sat for 2 days. And we stood, and none of us sat down, and none of us said anything, for a good deal longer than was necessary. I looked at him once. Only once. He was scarlet to the throat, and he hated every second of it. I could see it, and I was probably the only man in the room close enough to see it, and he bore it the way he had borne everything else, which is to say, without moving. Afterward in the corridor, when I tried to say something to him about it, he cut me off, not unkindly, efficiently, the way he did everything. "They weren't standing for me, Mr. Fenn," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you they were. They were standing because for 2 days nobody in that room could see me, and today they could, and it frightened them. That's all it was." He put his bearskin on and squared it. "Tell them to sit down next time. They'll get tired." 6 weeks later, the Assize of Harrogate issued a practice direction, 1 paragraph long, signed by the presiding judge and drafted, I happen to know, at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning by a man who had been up all night with a pen and no wig on. It provides that the direction to rise shall be given in the form "all who are able*", that no person shall be required to stand in any court of this realm who is unable to do so, that no explanation, certificate, or account of any kind shall be asked of such a person by any judge, at any time, for any reason, and that no inference of disrespect shall be drawn by anyone. The last sentence is the one I read most often, because I know exactly whose hand is in it. The court will not require a man to purchase his dignity, and shall not be the poorer for it. Private Ivo Wren had his wires out in April. He went back to the North Gate in the first week of May and stood his first 2-hour post since the assault, and there were a great many people on the pavement that morning who had come to watch, and he did not react to any of them, because that is the whole of the discipline, and because the man who taught it to him was 30 feet away inside the railings, in the shadow of the gatehouse, in a chair, watching his line from boots to chin strap. Once, at about the 90-minute mark, when the boy's chin had begun to come up, 2 gloved fingers moved a half-inch downward, and the chin came down. I saw them both again in the autumn. The King's Guard trooped its color on the 9th of October, on the great gravel square behind the palace, and I was there because a card had arrived at my house with my name on it in a clerk's hand better than my own, and no message, and no explanation, and a seat in the third row of the stand. Coram Deverell was in the second row. We nodded to one another and neither of us said anything, which was the correct arrangement, and I noticed that he had brought his own father's watch, which he wore only on days he considered important, and that he turned it over and over in his hand for the whole of the first hour. At the end, King Alaric came down the line. He went along the front rank of the guard slowly, and stopped and spoke and moved on, the way kings do, and the square was silent except for the wind pulling at the color. And at the end of the rank, drawn up beside the right marker in the position of the master of the colors, in full dress with his bearskin square and his brass burning, was Color Sergeant Corin Ashgrove. He put his hands to the wheels to come to the king. And King Alaric said, quite clearly, so that the front three ranks heard it and the stand heard it and the microphones heard it, "Don't get up." Then he turned to the equerry behind him and said, "Bring me a chair." There was a silence on that square of a kind I have never heard anywhere else, before or since. And a chair was brought, an ordinary folding chair, from the edge of the stand, carried at the double by a very frightened young lieutenant, and the King of Eldermore set it down on the gravel beside the master of the colors of his own guard, and sat on it, and stayed sitting on it, and watched his regiment march past from a plain chair on the ground, beside a man in a scarlet coat who could not stand. The color came round, and when it passed the two of them, every man on that square saluted it, and the king did not rise, because he had chosen not to, and Corin Ashgrove did not rise, because he could not, and in that moment I defy anyone to have told you which of the two was being honored. In the second row of the stand, Mr. Justice Coram Deverell stood up. He stood the whole of the march past, alone, with his hat in his hand and his father's watch closed in his fist, while everybody around him sat, and nobody asked him to explain himself, and nobody would have got an answer if they had. I am 71 now, and I have not been the clerk of court number 1 for 4 years, and my hands are not steady enough for the ledger any more. I keep folio 212 in the drawer of my desk. Not the original is where it should be, in volume 9, in a library on a second floor where nobody goes. My copy, the photocopy with my own initials in blue ink in the top right corner, that I put there in 4 seconds while holding a cup of tea and did not read. I do not keep it as a relic, I keep it as a bill. Because the thing that happened in court number 1 was not that a proud judge shouted at a wounded man. That is what the newspapers said, and it is the comfortable half, because it lets the rest of us stand about looking sorrowful at the back of the story where nobody can see our hands. What happened is that for 11 years a man sat among us with the whole of it written down, in plain language, in a public book, in a building I worked in, and none of us looked. He was not hiding. He never hid a thing in his life. We simply never thought there was anything under that scarlet worth the trouble of turning a page for. And then, when he did not do the small thing we expected of him, we did not ask why. We decided. That is the truth the court learned that day, and it had nothing to do with a gate, or a gantry, or 11 minutes on a burning stand. I called that court to its feet for 31 years. All rise. I never once thought about what the words were for. They are not for the judge. They are not even for the law. They are for the man who has already stood longer than any of us, in the dark, counting strangers out into the air one at a time, and who has earned, for the rest of his life, the right to stay exactly where he is.